Welcome to another fantastic presentation. I'm very happy and very blessed to have with us Roy Hunter, who is one of the legends in the world of hypnosis. His name is synonymous with regression and also parts therapy. Roy Hunter is a hypnosis trainer. He's a published author, and he's recognized around the world. He actually trained with Charles Tebbetts, the pioneer of parts therapy and a pioneer of client-centered hypnotherapy, who asked Roy Hunter to continue his work. And like I said, I've been blessed to train directly with Roy, so I know the caliber of a guy that he is. He has highly praised textbooks. His highly praised textbooks are used at hypnosis schools around the world, and he's been given lectures and workshops in over 20 countries around the world, and also, of course, online in nowadays. And he's received numerous awards throughout his career, including lifetime achievement from three different hypnosis organizations. He also has been inducted into the International Hypnosis Hall of Fame for his written contributions to hypnotherapy, and he's a life diplomat for IMDAJ and APHP organizations. So today, Roy will talk and will explain to us what's the deal with regression. So everybody say hello and welcome to Roy Hunter. Roy, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. I consider it an honor and a privilege to train.
Absolutely. And we are, more privileged than ever to learn about these things from you, because you know so much about the field of hypnosis in general and in particular about regression. So, if you can give us, let me start with this question. I know you have a presentation. I know you prepare because I know how you do work and how do you do stuff, but I just want to ask this question of you before we start. And that is, in your own words, how would you describe what is hypnosis?
Hypnosis is guided meditation. There are a lot of different definitions I've seen during my career, but I like the one best that I learned from my late mentor, Charles Tebbetts, who was a legend in hypnotherapy in the 20th century. And back in 1983, when I first studied under him, he said hypnosis is really guided meditation or guided self-hypnosis. And he also mentioned that imagination is a language of the subconscious. So we need to be careful how we say what we say. For example, if I said to someone, "You don't like cigarettes," the imagination would imagine a cigarette. So if I say, "Don't think of a dog," do you imagine seeing a dog or hearing a dog bark or petting a dog? So I focus on having the client imagine the desired outcome rather than avoidance of the problem.
Okay.
And by realizing that hypnosis is really guided meditation, I can say the right words, but it's up to the client to imagine what I ask him or her to imagine. So it's an art, but you have to be careful to say the words that are solution-oriented rather than problem-oriented.
Oh, I
hope that makes sense.
That. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, like the key idea right here is use words that are solution-oriented, not problem-oriented. I love that. And that's a reminder that we just need to keep on reminding ourselves and our clients as well. So continuing in the same vein, what would you say is hypnotic regression or regressive hypnosis, whichever formula you would like to use, because different people use it different ways. So what is your definition of regression in short?
Regression is in a meditative state, imagining or revivifying in your imagination a past event. In other words, you're not just analytically remembering it, you are reimagining it in your imagination while in a state of hypnosis. And that helps a person get in touch with his or her emotional feelings. So the primary purpose of emotion is to go back to the event that originally created the emotions surrounding the client's presenting problem, and then also going after the event that turned the problem on. The former is called the initial sensitizing event, or we call it ISE, which stands for initial sensitizing event, and the activating event, which some professionals call the SPE for symptom producing event. I prefer the activating event, but it's synonymous with SPE. The activating event can be one and the same as the initial sensitizing event, or the activating event can be days, weeks, months, or years, or on rare occasions, decades after the ISE. And there are many subsequent sensitizing events, but normally with most of the clients, most of the time, if you get the ISE and the activating event, all the events in between that cause further sensitizing topple like a stack of dominoes.
Now, when we do regression, oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes actually, you know, you have a sensitizing event which has absolutely no connection, no direct logical connection to the symptom event, activating event, right? And I'll give you an example. I had a client who had a phobia of water. She could get into the water up to her chest, but not further than that. If the water would go higher, she would just freak out. And when I worked with her and I did regression, and then she actually went back to a time when she fell into a ditch by the side of the road, but there is no water in the ditch. She was just in the ditch and felt kind of like alone, so to speak, when she was a kid. So why is this happening? How are these seemingly completely unrelated events connected? Because one would say, well, I have phobia of X because X happened to me in the past, but that, you know, will be logical to understand. What is your opinion on this, on these different connections, like on completely different spectrum?
I think I can best answer that with a case summary. A gentleman saw me for fear of flying. He was actually a hypnotherapist. And I did regression to the ISE. He was 7 years old and was at a family barbecue at a swimming pool. And his cousin, who loved to torment his family members, cousins, and siblings, pushed the 7-year-old in the water unexpectedly. And he had just finished exhaling a breath. So just a couple seconds underwater seemed like an eternity to him, because he literally was afraid he was going to drown. He couldn't get to the surface in time, and he felt I'm suffocating. And he had quite some vivid abreactions. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the word abreaction, it's having emotional discharges during a hypnotic regression therapy. And at any rate, that event was cleared. And then when I used idiomotor response questioning to find out whether there was anything else to be discovered and released, as I expected, I got a yes response, because I thought at the time, what does falling in a swimming pool have to do with fear of flying? It did not make any sense logically to me.
Yeah.
And he also had told me during the intake that he had flown tens of thousands of miles, and then all of a sudden had a fear of flying, and it didn't make sense to him. Well, when I moved him forward in time to what ended up being the activating event, which in his case took place when he was in his mid-30s. So this is one of the ones that was decades later. He was flying in a prop plane, which some people call a puddle jumper, and got caught in a thunderstorm in the Chicago area, bouncing up and down with lightning and thunder, and it was horrible turbulence. And he had always used a window seat so he could look out the window anytime there was turbulence. Problem: in a propeller-driven plane, there's a seat next to a steel beam, which is called a window seat, even though there's no window there. So he didn't have a window to look out. And as he's revivifying this in his imagination, I asked the word, how does this make you feel? He was analytical. I myself am analytical. So when I'm on the receiving end of regression, if I start to get into speaking in the past tense, it's important that the person who's facilitating my regression know to say, how does that make you feel?
Yeah, right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I said, imagine you're reliving it right now. What are you feeling? And he says, I feel like I'm going to suffocate, just like I felt when I was 7. So his subconscious connected the two events with emotion. And that is why the affect bridge is a great technique to use in regressing people, because the emotion will usually carry them back. And I say, go back to the very first time you felt those same feelings. Be there. What do you see, hear, or feel? Make a report. So I get the client into the initial sensitizing event. And then after that event is cleared, I want to ask the yes or no question, whether or not there is anything else that must be discovered or released. Because oftentimes the initial sensitizing event is also the activating event. For example, you mentioned fear of deep water. The case you described reminded me of a hypnotherapy student I had years ago in my class who was a volunteer for Regression to Clear Fears and Anxieties. She had a fear of deep water. She could get in shallow water, and she was fine in shallow water as long as it was only up to her shoulder. But if it was deeper than her shoulder, she would freak out. And I used Affect Bridge to go back to the first time she felt those same feelings. And she was 8 years old. And her older sister wanted to race her to the diving platform in a lake. And her sister got there first. But when she was still 10 to 15 feet away from the ladder at the platform, some bully dunked her under the water, and she thought she was going to drown. That was both her ISE and her activating event. So in her case, there was only one event to clear.
Yeah, yeah. So from your experience, when you are doing regression, how many steps are there involved in a regressing process? Like like in a session, when you do a regression session with a client, do you have like a certain number of steps that you go through? You know, it's like step 1, step 2, step 7, step 22. I don't know.
I call them phases. And the first phase is the preparation, client preparation.
Yeah.
And that includes a pre-talk, because in the 80s and 90s, regression got a bad rap because there were people who did not understand the risk of false memories. So the very important first step of the preparation phase is to give a pre-talk. So if regression is indicated, because I would say probably only about 40% of the clients I've seen throughout my career have had to experience regression in my office. I use it when it's indicated. If someone uses the same technique for all the people all the time, there's no technique that is so good that it will work with all the people all the time. So I fit the technique to the client instead of trying to fit the client to my technique. But getting back to the question, when regression is indicated, I'll say in a few minutes in hypnosis, I'm going to guide you back in time to discover the core cause of your problem, whatever the presenting problem is. And I'll say, we don't always remember things accurately, especially when emotions are involved. For example, 2 children could witness a fight in a schoolyard and give a teacher different versions just minutes later. Or any parent of 2 or more siblings knows that children can witness something and both give different versions, but each one believes he or she is telling the truth. But they can't both be telling the truth. And that's because our perceptions can be altered by emotions. So when I guide you back in time to what you, at a subconscious level, believe or remember as the core cause of the problem, what you experienced might be different than what you remember, but you are responding to your subconscious perceptions. So it's not my job to sort out the fact from the fantasy, because it might be fact, it might be fantasy. As often as not, it's a combination of both. Any questions? So I want the client to be comfortable, because the last thing I want is for a client to leave my office and go confront some family member for an event that didn't happen the way the client remembered it in hypnosis. So that's for my protection as well as the client's protection, because there was a lot of litigation that went on in the 80s and 90s because of false memory syndrome. Parents were tired of being accused by their adult children of abuse that never took place.
Yeah. So that was basically the root of it.
That. Pardon?
Yeah, so that was the root of it, right? Like, it was that kind of like a revenge from the child, or was that kind of a backlash? What was that about?
Well, there were people who believed the wrong thing. For example, a lady came to me for weight management in the late 1980s, and 5 minutes into the session, into the intake, she said, "Do you do regression therapy?" And I said, "Why do you ask?" She said, "Well, because I was seeing a family marriage counselor last year, and she said she was a great help for our troubled teenager. And then I asked her if she could recommend a good hypnotherapist for weight management. And she said, "Yes, I'm a certified hypnotherapist. I'll help you." So I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Well, I went for the first session, and she tells me that problems often start because of some past event. And she said most women who are heavy were abused as children. Were you ever abused as a child?" And she said, "No." She said, "We had a very loving family." And she said, "My parents were both very affectionate." And she said, her counselor then said, "Well, we'll use regression to find out." And she said that she guided her back in her imagination to when she was in her early teens and said, "Go back to a time when your father hugged you." And then she said, the therapist asked, "Can you feel your father's private parts, or is he touching your private parts?" And she said it took her sister and mother 3 weeks to convince her that there was not a molesting bone in her father's body. So things like that happened in the 80s and 90s is why regression got a bad rap, and people went from one extreme to the other. So Bruce Eimer and I, realizing that there was a genuine risk of false memories, decided to give a professional response. And that's what motivated us to write this book. Bruce Eimer is a licensed clinical psychologist, and this book not only is a professional response to the regression critics, but it also helped build a bridge between psychology and hypnotherapy.
Got it.
And I go through the 5 phases in there. Part of the first phase is getting a client deep enough, because I'm a very analytical person, and if I'm not deep enough, a regression is a waste of my time if I'm on the client side. So in the 2-day workshop that I teach on regression, which is available on my website, by the way, for downloading from my Dropbox, it's a 2-day workshop with breaks and most off-topic questions edited out. But I go through the entire 5 phases step by step.
So which are the 5 phases in, like, if you could like give us a brief preview of that?
I discussed the first one already, which is client preparation. The second phase is regression techniques to discover the cause, because if a person does not respond to the affect bridge technique, there are other ways to regress somebody. Age regression, regression by calendar years, and there are a couple other types of regressions I don't have time to go into and explain in this short presentation. But I will attempt 3 different techniques before I abort the session. And if I have to abort the session, which on rare occasions I do, then I'll give suggestions that every time I hypnotize you, you go deeper than the time before until you are able to reach and maintain your ideal level of hypnosis or your perfect trance depth. I use the Ericksonian double bind, the suggestion, and then I will give the client a homework assignment to listen to one of my meditation audios several times between the 2 sessions. So most of the clients I'm able to get deep enough at the time, but that part of the preparation is making sure that the client, especially if he or she is analytical like I am, is deep enough to have a successful regression. And then the 3rd phase is abreactions and release. So when the person starts tapping into those emotions and has an emotional discharge, then that's the 3rd phase. And there are techniques involved in that, having the person reimagine it or relive it in the imagination as it was perceived by the subconscious. Then I detach the client from that through a dissociation technique, taking the client to his or her peaceful place. And then I ask them to go back with their present adult knowledge, wisdom, understanding, training, and awareness, and be the adult along with the 5-year-old or 7-year-old or however old they were at the time of the ISE.
Yeah.
And then I have them go back and do Gestalt role play with the real or imagined perpetrator or perpetrators. And in one case that comes to mind immediately, the man had a fear of driving over bridges. His ISE ended up being the same as the activating event. 2 bullies caught him on his way home from school and picked him up by the arm, by each arm, and dangled him over the edge of a bridge. And there was 50 feet of space between him and the raging river below. And that was a traumatic event that terrified that boy. And then when he saw me in his mid-30s, he still had a fear of bridges. So he couldn't drive across the Narrows Bridge, which is a suspension bridge in the Seattle-Tacoma area that is almost like the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah.
So he could ride, but he would have to close his eyes while going across that bridge. And it turned out that after I asked him if he needed anything else, he wanted to go back and do Gestalt role play with the bridge, an inanimate object. That's rare, but it just happened a few times. So speaking as a bridge, I'm here to get you across the river. You can't blame me for what the bullies did to you.
Yeah.
So you never know what to expect, but it's important to be properly trained in regression before you facilitate it. Unfortunately, one of the reasons regression got a bad rap is because some people didn't know that there was an ISE and an activating event, and they would keep a client in regression for weeks and weeks, or in some cases, months. I saw a woman who had a fear of birds and feathers. She spent 9 months in regression therapy with a psychologist who didn't know how to help her release something. As soon as she would start having emotional reactions, he would bring her up out of hypnosis and then do psychological counseling. And what happened is 9 months after weekly or bi-weekly sessions, I think twice a month. Is that bi-weekly or bi-weekly is twice a week?
Exactly,
anyway, she had 2 sessions a month for 9 months and then realized that her fear of birds and feathers was worse instead of better, because it was like another subsequent sensitizing event, since she was not allowed to release those emotions in hypnosis. So that's where forgiveness doesn't mean condoning, but forgive without condoning the real or imagined perpetrator, the apology he or she used to owe you, or give that person his or her problem back, and then forgive yourself for carrying the emotions. all those years. And that's part of abreactions and release. And then the fourth phase is subconscious reprogramming, because if I give a person suggestions about quitting smoking and the suggestions are rejected, like in one case, the case that comes to mind, the ISE was the activating event. He was a teenager smoking a cigarette behind the barn with a couple of school buddies, and his father came out, chewed him out in front of his friends, embarrassed him, then sent his friends home. And in the regression, during the Gestalt role play, he says, "Dad, you're nothing but a blanking hypocrite."
Why is that?
He says, "You're telling me not to smoke while you're standing there blowing cigarette smoke in my face." So he was making a statement of rebellion against his father for his hypocrisy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once he was able to forgive his dad for the manner in which he handled it, then his subconscious was now unencumbered to accept the hypnotic suggestions to be a non-smoker. But that event had so much emotion that the emotion surrounding his hypocritical father telling him don't smoke pushed his rebel button. So he was making a statement against his father's hypocrisy by smoking. That he wasn't aware of that consciously, but that was happening at a subconscious level. But once that block was cleared, his subconscious was now open for relearning or subconscious reprogramming. And then the last phase is concluding the session, giving additional ego strengthening suggestions, doing a slow emerging from hypnosis, and then the debrief. So those are the 5 phases. And Dr. Eimer and I go into those phases in depth in our book. I also go through those phases in depth in the regression workshop that's available on my website.
Yeah. So
that's a long answer to your question.
No, but that's a great answer. And, it raises so many questions because, sometimes you have clients who come in and they can be, I don't know, let's say, at least 2 types of clients. One who says, "Oh, I heard about hypnosis and regression, and I don't want you to regress me to a past life because I don't know what happened there, and I don't want to re-experience those things." And then you have the other guys who said, "I would like you to regress me to a past life because I know there's something amazing happened, and I was a big shot in the past life, not just a regular John Doe that I am today." So how do you handle those kind of requests when people come to you to, directly request of you to do regression? They're not even coming to a hypnosis session. They're not coming to a, "I need some help with something" session. They come to a particular specific regression session.
Very rarely do I have a client come and ask for a regression to something in the current life, unless it's to find a lost object. And I've had many of those during my career. But I've regressed them to the last time they remember at a conscious level having the object or seeing the object or the money or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to know the difference between leading and guiding. So that's explained in the workshop and in the book. I don't really have time to go into that here, but I'll simply summarize it by saying leading questions are assumptions, such as client says, "Daddy punishes me. When does Daddy spank you?" That's a leading question because it's assuming the punishment was a spanking. And in my classroom, a student made that mistake. Fortunately for the client, he remembered consciously that he got sent to his room without dinner and got grounded for the weekend. Otherwise, there could have been a false memory. So if the person facilitating the regression doesn't know the difference between guiding and leading, they can implant false memories. But far more often, when a client asks for a regression as the reason for the session, they're requesting a past life regression. And I'll mention, first of all, there are a lot of hypnotherapists who are past life believers. A lot of them are past life skeptics, and many people in our profession are undecided. Now, whether you are a past life believer, a past life skeptic, or undecided, we do not have a right to project our opinions into the client. So if someone asks me about past life regressions when I'm doing a group presentation, or if a client, which has happened maybe a dozen times in my career, has a spontaneous past life regression, I'll say there are several explanations as to what happened. One, it could be fantasy or metaphor or false memory. Perhaps you might have remembered a movie that you saw when you were a child, or perhaps somebody said something. This was what I was saying to a lady who was a Lutheran Sunday school teacher who saw me for fear of flying. And she had a spontaneous past life regression when I go back to the first time you felt those same feelings. And in that real or imagined past life regression, she locked herself in a gallery or in some sort of cabinet when she stowed away on a ship to America. And it took me several minutes into the regression to realize that wasn't her current life. And then after she emerged from hypnosis, or just prior to emerging from hypnosis during the relearning phase, she said, "Oh, it's not the fear of heights that makes me afraid to fly. It's the fear of suffocating to death like I did in that past life." And knowing she was a Lutheran and having attended a Lutheran church several months, I know they don't believe in past lives. Her first comment was, "Wow, I didn't know I believed in that stuff. Do you think I could have lived that life?" That's a no-win question, because if I say yes, she could have a crisis of faith. It could cause all kinds of stress in her family. And she and her husband were also good friends of the pastor and his wife. So you can imagine that could have bothered her horribly. And
so
if
what
I
did
said
you answer
no,
to that question?
if I give a yes or a no, either one is wrong, because if I say no, I just invalidated the therapy and she wasted her time and money. So I said there are several possible explanations. One is fantasy or metaphor or false memory. You might have seen a movie when you were a kid or heard a story about someone who died on a ship that they stowed away on. Or some people believe it takes more than one lifetime to evolve spiritually enough to go to heaven. Others believe that we can tap into the book of life and the universal library and access memories of somebody else who lived. And nowadays, I say it could be like a spiritual internet where you're tapping into universal consciousness or the Holy Spirit and access memories of somebody who's on the other side. Some people believe that the memories can be passed on genetically. You're free to draw your own conclusions, but what's important is your subconscious found a way for you to release your fear of flying so that you can get on that plane to Chicago next week.
Yeah. Just to pitch in, adding to what you just said, what I often tell clients is, when they ask, is this for real? Is this happening? Or is that the real cause of my issue? And I say, well, sometimes the mind creates an excuse both for the problem and for the solution. So if that's what came to your mind from the subconscious mind, and that's an excuse that your subconscious mind created to release the problem, and we're happy with that, and let's go test it. It's not about what I believe is true or false, but let's go test it.
That's a good way to put it. As fate would have it, I ran into this lady several years later, and she said, "Oh, hi, remember me?" I'm not good with names and faces because I've met so many thousands of people just in the hypnotherapy profession. I can't remember all of my clients either. And I said, are you one of my former clients? And she said, oh, yes, I'm the one that saw you for fear of flying and regressed into a past life. She's saying this in front of people in line to check out a movie at a video store.
Yeah.
And she says, I just want you to know I've flown over 250,000 miles since that session. And she said, I'm also reading every Edgar Cayce book I can get my hands on. But it was her conclusion to choose to believe that it was a regression into a real past life.
Yeah.
It wasn't my place to say whether I did or didn't believe it was a genuine past life regression, because of what I already mentioned, she could have had a crisis of faith. Well, and her husband or pastor could have poured cold water all over it, but there's nothing they could criticize me for when I told her the several explanations if she related that to her husband.
Yeah. And actually, I wanna ask you a question which is more related to ethics than anything else. Okay. What is your opinion on people who are teaching like exclusively, past life regression courses or hypnosis for that matter? Because that's kind of like, to me, that's kind of like, it doesn't even matter what the problem is, or it doesn't even matter if that's so or not. It's not so, because you know what I mean? It's like,
yes, I do. They're taking a professional risk. I know someone who's a published author and well known in our profession who advertises openly that he does past life regressions. And although I believe he's taking a risk, he's reaching a limited part of the market, because they're probably not more than 30 to 40% of people in America who are even open-minded about past lives. So he's excluding the rest of the market. I do not know how much he's risking the credibility of our profession when he is openly advertising that. But I don't openly advertise that I do that. And in terms of my own beliefs, I don't announce to the public how I believe, but I will admit that I personally am a past life believer, but there are ethical guidelines for the believer, the skeptic, and the undecided. If you're undecided, you can truthfully say, if you're asking a question in a public presentation to the general public, you can say, well, there are several possible explanations, and you can go through what I mentioned earlier in this talk. And then you can say, you're free to draw your own conclusions. And then once in a while, somebody will raise his or her hand and say, what's your personal belief?
Yeah.
And I'll say, I cannot scientifically prove or disprove which of those explanations is applicable in any specific case. But we need to move on to another topic. Next question, please. And then if they insist, I'll say, you're welcome to talk to me privately after the talk, because I learned the hard way many years ago when I had over 100 people in the audience. Someone said, well, what do you believe? And I said, well, I had a spontaneous past life memory flashback once.
Yeah.
I got no phone calls, because immediately after I said that, the vice president of that group said, well, I'm a Christian, and it's a doctrine of demons if you believe in reincarnation. So I would recommend none of you see this man for any sessions. I was mad at myself. I didn't know whether to be mad at myself or mad at him or mad at both of us, but I thought that was unprofessional of him. But I realized I made a mistake. So if you say you either believe in it or don't believe in it, you're going to turn off probably 30 to 40% of the people in your audience. So it's wisest, unless you're among hypnotherapists, to keep your opinion to yourself.
Yeah, which is kind of tough to do, especially in this world, because people are so needy of definite results and definite answers. It's like it's black or white kind of a question.
Yeah. Now, the past life skeptic also has an ethical issue, because it is unethical for the past life skeptic to tell the client, there's no scientific proof that we lived in past lives, and it's not ethical for me to do that. Or if you say, I don't believe in past lives, you're basically turning the client off. And I had a real discussion with somebody who wanted me to join his organization about 30 years ago. And I said, how do you handle it if a client asks you for a past life regression? Oh, I just tell him it's unethical, and our organization says it's unethical. And I said, well, then I decline to accept invitation to be a member of your organization because I don't accept those ethics. And I said, you can be turning a client off if you criticize him or her for asking for a past life regression. And when someone asks me to do a past life regression, I say, why do you ask? I learned the hard way years ago. A lady said, by the way, before we start my non-smoking sessions, I'd like to ask, do you do past life regressions? And I said, only if requested. And her response was, well, I want to thank you for your honesty in telling me that, but now that I know you do the devil's work, I'm going to see another hypnotherapist to quit smoking.
This is so funny. Like, for me, it's the exact opposite. Like, I wouldn't say on a daily basis, but pretty often I get requested for regression therapy. It's not like regression sessions, not therapy. So like, people come in and say, I would like to do regression. What for? Because I think I have a problem, and I know that if I do regression, that will solve my problem. No, it won't necessarily. So
that doesn't happen as often, at least in my neck of the woods. I've had, I don't know, maybe only a dozen requests for regression in the current life, other than to remember where they placed a lost item. However, I was going to mention, as an example of a past life skeptic, the late Paul Durbin was a general, retired general from the military, and a Methodist minister. He also was a hypnotherapist and wrote some books. He was a total past life skeptic, but I knew Paul quite well, and he told me that he was always willing to respond to a client's request to do a past life regression because he was comfortable with the other explanations other than the idea that it might have been a legitimate past life that the client lived. But he felt that it was ethical to honor the client's request because he didn't have to tell the client that he was a past life skeptic. So I appreciate his ethics of being willing to honor a client's request to do a past life regression without letting the client know that he was a past life skeptic. That was Paul Durbin for you. Yeah,
there you go. There you go. So, Roy, let me ask you this. When you are working with regression, you do a pre-talk, you go through the phases, through the motions, let's say, with doing regression. When people ask you after your intervention, when people ask you, is it done? Do I need another session? Is it fixed? Is my problem solved? What is your response to that question?
I ask them before they emerge from hypnosis, whether there's anything else to discuss, to discover, and release. So I have asked them that question while they're still in hypnosis. So if I get the no response, that there's nothing else to discover and release, then I give post-hypnotic suggestions for the problem to be resolved and the success to be long-lasting. And then I'll let them know that afterwards. So if they happen to ask, will my problem be resolved now? I'll let them know, well, I ask your subconscious if the problem was resolved, and your subconscious or inner mind said yes. Very, very seldom has a client backslid after confirming that the problem is resolved during the state of hypnosis. So that's an important part of that subconscious relearning step is to make sure that the suggestions have been accepted by the subconscious. So if you do a thorough job, the technique that I use for regression, let's just say the protocol that Bruce Weimer and I have, he did a very similar protocol before we ever met, because he was one of the few psychologists who did hypnosis regularly. He was a pain psychologist at a major hospital in the Philadelphia area, and oftentimes he would use regression to go back, especially, you know, if the client was suffering chronic pain. So he helped a lot of chronic pain patients. And now he's retired from his practice in the hospital, and he moved to Florida. So he's a practicing psychologist and hypnotherapist in the state of Florida now. So we've stayed in contact. We even co-authored another book since the regression text.
Got it. From your experience when doing regression work, how many sessions do you normally do? Do you book the clients for a package, or do you say, let's meet and then we'll go from there? How do you work with that?
I will answer that in two parts. The second part I'll say first, because where I live, we give an estimate of the number of sessions required, but we are not allowed to charge in advance for sessions.
Okay.
We used to be able to charge in advance for sessions by the state government. If we charge for prepaid sessions in advance within Washington State, then we have to set up an escrow account, and it's a big
deal. Yeah.
It's a real big deal, because we cannot take the money out, nor can we have it in an interest-bearing account. We can't draw the money out until the sessions are taken. So if a client prepays for 5 sessions and only sees you 3 times, you will eventually have to either refund the balance to the client, but or keep it indefinitely. So that's a real problem. But I used to be able to estimate, for example, if a client saw me for smoking cessation, I wouldn't accept them unless they would commit to at least 3 sessions, because although my approach isn't the only one that works, it's past the test of time. And the third session is in case they're having problems. The first session, I have them identify the benefits of success, project them forward in time to bond emotionally with their benefits. And oftentimes the emotion, the desire to enjoy those benefits, is sufficient for the client to succeed without the need of ever having regression or parts therapy or other techniques to discover resistance. So it's like a great percentage of my clients succeed without any advanced techniques. Then the second session I devote to teaching self-hypnosis for stress management, because when I surveyed clients for 5 years to get my long-term success rate for various common topics like weight management and smoking cessation, I found out that clients who backslid, stress caused more backsliding than all other reasons combined.
Wow, really?
Yes. So it was the #1 cause of backsliding, so much so that out of all the people I surveyed, the ones that backslid, over half of them backslid from stress. So that was by far and away the #1 cause of backsliding. So
why would that be? Because like they have the pathways already in place for that process to take place again?
They use the cigarette as a stress coping techniques, and it's easier to replace an automatic response than it is to erase it. So I use self-hypnosis to teach a client a new response for stress triggers when someone pushes their buttons. And then the third session is client-centered, based on if they're doing great, I reinforce what's working. So every day gets easier than the day before. Every week gets easier than the week before, until it becomes so easy you feel as though you've always been a non-smoker. And I teach clients to become a totally tolerant non-smoker. But if they're having subconscious resistance, then sometimes I'll use regression, sometimes I'll use parts, and I'll go through some idiomotor response questions, yes or no questions, to find the category, whether it's past experience or authority imprint, to determine whether to use regression or parts therapy to discover the cause of the subconscious resistance. So consequently, probably only a third of the clients who've seen me for smoking cessation during my almost 4 decades of practice have ever experienced regression. And probably 20 to 30% have experienced parts therapy to discover why there was a part of the subconscious resisting the positive suggestions. So I fit the technique to the client rather than trying to fit the client to my technique. And when the client sees me for weight management, it might be anywhere from 4 to 8 sessions, depending on whether they're slightly overweight, moderately overweight, or obese. And I also will use regression as a technique of choice if they're seeing me for fears and anxieties, like fear of flying or fear of heights. I know that regression is going to be the best choice in those cases.
And this actually goes me, takes me to the next question, which is, we're approaching the end, but what is like the most common problem that you've seen clients that you helped with regression?
Fears and anxieties.
Fears and anxieties,
where I know in advance in the intake I'm going to use regression. But I will say that probably 40 to 50% of the clients who've seen me for weight management during my career have also had to experience regression to discover the core causes of overeating.
And so I picked up on this, and I just want to, ask again, just to make triple sure in my head. You work with somebody with regression, let's say somebody who wants to quit smoking, or somebody who has a problem like fear of public speaking or whatever. So you use regression, and then you said that under stress or duress, they will actually regress back to, the presenting problem, so to speak. And that's because of the stress they go through, right? Did I get that correct?
I don't necessarily use regression if a person backslides from a stressful event.
Okay.
Let's say someone sees me
with a client.
Pardon?
Okay, you go ahead. Yeah.
Let's say someone sees me for smoking cessation, and then they backslide 3 or 4 months later, and they come back in for a follow-up. I will go through finger response questions, which, by the way, we have a chapter on those in here, the 7 psychodynamics of a symptom, and determine from that whether to use parts therapy or regression therapy.
Okay.
And then if it's parts therapy, I'll talk to that part that caused them to backslide and go from there. And I don't have time to go through the parts therapy process here. If it's regression, then I'll go back to discover the ISE and the activating event and release them.
Got it. Awesome. Roy, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for all of the wonderful information you've shared with us. Where can people get in touch with you? How can they learn more from you or reach out to you?
www.royhunter.com. I have a lot of articles on my website, and in fact, I invite you to write an article, and I'll post it on my website. You're a well-known name.
I'll be very happy and honored to do so.
Thank you. I have articles on my website, and you can buy my books off my website. However, if you live in Europe, you might save on the cost of shipping if you buy my books directly from Crown House Publishing. They're located in the UK.
Got it.
That will cost a lot less than having them shipped from the USA overseas.
Of course. Of course. So everybody, you know where to find Roy Hunter, royhunter.com. That's his website. Go ahead and check it out. See what you can get from there. Get in touch with Roy if you have more questions. Now, let's take a quick break and share with us your insights, your information, your knowledge that you gathered from this presentation. Share them with us in the Facebook group. Let us know the three main ideas you got from this presentation. So let's take a quick break, and I'll see you after the break. I will see you in the next day. Thank you so much.